Hello folks, welcome to my Review Buddy program. So this is to help developers who are new to Java, new to Spring Boot, Quarkus or Micronaut kind of a frameworks, where you learn those technologies and frameworks, you build an application, but you would like to have some experienced people to take a look at it and then provide some feedback. So this program does exactly that. So what you can do, if you build an application and you want to get it reviewed by me, you can come to this repository and click on these issues and you can create a new issue. So here you can choose this code review request, and here you can provide the details of your project and where is the repository and maybe some details about the application you are building, what technologies you are using and all that. So once you create a request, I can take a look at it and then I'll provide my feedback. Maybe there are some things that can be improved or some things I can learn from it. So it is kind of a win-win situation. So in this first episode, I'm going to pick Home Appliance Manager and I'm going to review this and share my thoughts on this application code. Let's start with reviewing of Home Appliance Manager. So here, if you take a look at the repository, you can see this is to manage home appliances details, like what kind of a products they bought and what is their warranty details and from whom they bought it and the invoice management. So basic CRUD operations, and the tech stack is Java 21 Spring Boot latest version and using MySQL for database, and also using Spring Security JWT token based authentication, and also using Cloudinary for storing images, invoice images, and that is it. So now, of course, the prerequisites, you should have Java and Maven. We can use Maven wrapper itself and Docker and Docker Compose. Project structure. So what I like about this repository is it is always a good step to create a decent README file with the details about what this project is about, what kind of features already implemented or planned for, and what is the tech stack that is being used, and in order to use this application, what prerequisites you need to have. So these are the basic details that every project should have. And how to get started. Let's say I want to clone it and then start working on it. So here I can clone it and then I need to create this environment file. But we'll see how this helps. So how to start MySQL database. So here we can use Docker Compose to spin up a MySQL database, but I think we can improve on that, but we'll take a look at it. So basically README looks fine, and also all the API endpoint details are listed down. You can take a look at, okay, what is the payload looks like and what is the response look like. So I like this details about this project. So now I have cloned the repository, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over one aspect at a time and take a look at all the code and see where things can be improved. Okay, so I have already cloned Home Appliance Manager. Now, first, I usually start taking a look at the build script. In this case, Maven is being used, but if it is Gradle, I will take a look at the build.gradle file just to get a glimpse of what are the libraries that are used and all that. So here, okay, this repository is already using the most recent latest version of Spring Boot. Cool. And Java 21, okay, not bad. And all these usual starters to use Spring Data's API and security, web dependency for REST APIs. And there is Jackson data type. I don't think we need to explicitly add this. I'll tell you why. Because we have this Spring Boot starter web, which means it is already going to pull JSON starter as well, which internally depends on this. So you don't need to explicitly add this one. For example, we can take a look at, okay, so here, if you take a look at the dependencies, you can see Spring Boot starter web is added, which automatically pulls starter JSON. Starter JSON already has a dependency on this JSR 310 library. So you don't need to add this explicitly. When you add web starter, it is going to automatically pulled transitively. And Cloudinary dependency, I have never used it, but I guess it is some library that can be used to upload images to some cloud service. We are using MySQL and JSON Web Token and also OAuth to resource server. This is something fishy. So usually you can create JWT tokens either using purely JJWT library, or if you want to use OAuth to resource server, you can do that. You don't need to use them together. So I think there can be something that can be corrected or improved, but let's see. But ideally, if you want to use OAuth to resource server based JWT token mechanism, you can do it alone. You don't need to use this. Or if you don't want to use OAuth to resource server, you can simply use JJWT and then implementation and all those things, and you will be able to generate the tokens and then decode the tokens. But you don't need to use them together. Okay, so let's go ahead, and I don't know why we need this. Maybe you can simply remove this and see if it application is working fine or not, or is it going to be transitively pulled. In my experience, I never had to use this dependency added explicitly. And another one is Lombok. Lombok, fine, but here it doesn't mention any scope. That means this Lombok library is going to be bundled along with your fat jar, which is not required. So basically Lombok is a annotation processor which is only required during the compilation phase. And once the compilation is done, you don't need this to be on the class path. For example, let's go to Spring Initializer. And here, if you take a look at the Lombok, and if you take a look at the so here you can see optional is true. So if you come back, you can add this. So what does this optional true does? It is going to be while having this compilation phase and all that, but it is not going to be bundled when you build the final jar file. So this is sufficient. If you don't add this one, this library is going to be part of the final Uber jar or fat jar, whatever you call it, which is not required, unnecessary. So fine. We have Springboot starter test, and we have web MVC UI for Swagger documentation. Nice. It seems a little older version. Maybe we can. So if you are using IntelliJ, you can press Control Space and you can see what is the most recent version. So I can simply upgrade that. Spring security test dependency is commented out. But if I take a look at the code, there is no test directory at all, which means there is no tests at all, which is sad. Okay, anything fine. And yeah, so these are the things about the dependencies and Maven configuration. Now let's move on to something else. Here, when I see README, here we can see manually they mentioned first we need to Docker compose up and then you can run the application, but Spring Boot provides this Docker Compose support out of the box, so you don't need to do it separately. If you use the Docker Compose support, you can right away start your application, which is going to automatically start the containers that are defined in this Docker Compose file, and also automatically configure this data source with the application. So it is simplifies a lot. So let's see how we can do that. Again, if I go to here and see, here there is Docker Compose support. If I select that and explore it, here there is a dependency which I can copy and let me paste it over here. So now, once we have this Spring Boot or Docker Compose support, again, you can see this optional true because we don't need this for running the application. This is only for helping us during the development time. When I start this application, it is going to take a look at this Docker Compose YAML file and start all the services. Okay, so here we have MySQL, and again, as you have not mentioned any tag, it's going to use latest, which is not really a good practice. Basically, you should stick to one specific version, be it whatever 8027 or whichever the latest one or what you are planning to use. You should definitely mention that so that you won't get any surprises, because today it might work fine with whatever the MySQL latest version, and then let's say after a year some new version got released and you didn't change any source code, but something got changed in the MySQL version and your application may fail to start, and you don't know, I didn't change any code but it was working till last week and now it is not working. You get into those kind of situations. So the best thing is clearly specify what is the version you want to use. Let's say we want to use the latest version 940. So I mentioned it explicitly. Now I'm going to start the application and let's see what happens. So here you can see it tried to start the application and it failed for some reason. Here could not resolve placeholder cloudinary name. So let's take a look at where this configuration is. So here in application.properties, these properties will be overridden by the Docker Compose support with whatever the properties you configure here, but it expects the other properties to be configured like environment variables or things like that. So cloud name, API key. So we need to provide these values. Otherwise, as you can see, it fails to start. One option that you can do is you can provide some default value, some name, and again some key, secret. Of course, it won't work with these values, but your application could start unless you are trying to connect with that cloud service on application startup and all. But just for proceeding further, you can follow this pattern where you can provide the default value like this. So this is usually a practice I usually follow. For example, even for database properties, I configure something like this. So database URL, if you provide environment variable, that is going to take the high priority. Otherwise, this is going to be used as a default value. So that is how I usually configure my application properties. So with these values, let's see if we can start the application successfully or not. Looks like it worked fine. And one nice thing, if you want to check, okay, I'm using IntelliJIDEA Ultimate Edition, and also there is a Spring Debugger plugin that can help you to see the actual values. Here you can see this is the actual value, and also apparently these are same, but if they are different, you can see it has a different value. And also you can see if a Spring Debugger plugin is installed, when you start the application, it will automatically register the data source. You don't need to manually register that. You can see it created these two tables also. So nice. Let's minimize this and we have the application running. Cool. So the point is, you don't need to do this manual step. You can use Docker Compose support and it will automatically start the containers, and then if it is a SQL database, it will automatically register the data source and your application will connect to this database. So that is something that you can improve. Also, another thing to notice here, we are using Spring JPA Hibernate DDL auto update, which means based on your entity JPA entity structures, it is going to automatically create the tables or update the tables. That is fine for a POC, but definitely you should try to use either Liquibase or Flyway kind of database migration tools for production. So let's start with reviewing entities here. So here we have a user entity and a bunch of Lombok annotations. Okay, so here is one thing. Right now, you do not explicitly mention the table name. So based on the entity name, it's going to automatically generate, in this case, as you can see, it generated a table called user. But I would recommend to use at table annotation specifying exactly what table name you want to have. Because let's say for whatever reason, if you change this name to user entity and then you restart, it's going to create a new table called user entity. Or for that matter, I just want to make it explicit with the because I may follow some convention like user underscore accounts or something like that, but you don't usually use underscores in your class names, so I prefer to make it explicit using this at table annotation. And another thing is here we are using the same JPA entity for Spring Security also to represent the authenticated user. Again, for a simple application like this, that could be fine, but maybe I would prefer to have a security user or something like that that implements user details. But no big deal. It's a small application. This is fine. And let's take a look at what other things. Okay, this is the primary key. But in addition to that, there is another field called user ID, probably kind of using UUID to make it unique. Okay, user's password, full name, email, and mobile number. Okay, so here I think the naming convention in Java, usually we follow naming convention like Pascal case or camel case, whatever it is called. So instead of using underscores, you should follow something like this: full name, similarly mobile, capital M O. And there is a association from user to products with one-to-many association, bidirectional association. Fine. Okay. And for roles, because we are implementing user details, which expects us to implement some of the methods, there is this get authorities. Usually you can hold a role property. It could be a role user or it could be role admin or something like that, and then you can use that role. In future, if you want to support multiple types of roles, you can achieve that. Again, for this use case, seems fine. And also we are going to use email as username. This is also looks nice. Here we are overriding these properties, but simply delegating to the super class methods. Again, if you take a look at these user details, only there are these three methods that needs to be implemented, but these methods are already provide some default implementation, which you don't need to implement unless you implement some different behavior. But here we are simply delegating the calls to superclass method, which means you don't need to actually implement these things. We can remove this, and again, password, you written this password. This is fine. Okay, now let's take a look at the product. And again, I would recommend to use explicit table annotation and specify what is the table name you want to create. And again, here also we have some unique, in addition to the primary key, again, naming convention, it is capital I. Usually we follow small it. Okay, so it is good to follow the basic Java naming conventions. Typically, everyone follows that. And we have a bunch of other classes that are embedded here. And finally, this is bidirectional relation from products to user, which is fine. Okay, we are using this embedded, and okay, here we have all these details. Let's take a look at the product details. Here we have name, again, naming convention. It can be changed. And this is an embeddable class. Usually you can use class or record as well. In the recent versions of Hibernate JPA, it also supports using records. You can use records as well. And one thing is, this should not be here. At attribute overrides usually to change. If you want to map this property to a different column name, depending on where you are using, That's where you should be adding this attribute overrides, not in this embeddable class itself. For example, let's take a look at this attribute overrides annotation source code. Here you can see this employment period is some embeddable, and they have injected into some other entity, and then they use this attribute overrides to provide, okay, this is a start date property in the employment period, but the column name we want is emp underscore start. So this is how you override. For example, if you want to inject this into a completely different one and you want to have a different column names, you can do that. But if you put these annotations here itself, there is no point writing here, because you can name them accordingly directly, product name or something like that here. So this ideally should go into where we are embedding this into product, right? So it should be here. Okay, so to make it clear, for example, you have similar to product details. Let's say you have an address which contains address line 1, line 2, city, state, and all that, right? And in your whatever user, you want to keep both present address and permanent address, but the columns are same. But I mean the properties are same, but you can have perm address line 1, perm address line 2, and also you want to have a present address line 1. So things like that. Now you can inject two address objects and use the attribute overrides annotation, and then you can map those properties into multiple columns. So that is how we should use. Instead of adding the attribute overrides here, you should be adding that where you are using them. So like this, here you should be using them. So the same applies to all these embeddables. So that's it about entities. And there are DTOs, authentication request, invoice request. I kind of get a feeling that you can use records for this purpose instead of creating a class and all that. And also, because you are using Lombok, you can still use builder with records as well. So instead of classes, maybe you can use records for these DTOs. Next, let us take a look at the repositories. So here we have a user repository, which is fine. We are simply extending JPA repository, and we have two finder methods. This is cool. And let's take a look at the product repository. Here, basically, when we are extending Spring Data JPA repositories, we don't need to add this at repository. I mean, having this doesn't harm you, but you don't need that. Similar to user repository, which you haven't added this annotation, you don't need to add this here as well. And we have find by product ID, which is a unique property. This is fine. Delete by product ID. Again, this is fine. And here we are trying to find the products for the given user ID. And we are using custom JPQL here. But in this case, we don't actually need this, because Spring Data JPA is going to strip off this find whatever by, this is going to be removed, and then try to figure out the where class with the rest of the thing. So in our case, it is going to use the user.id, something like that. Spring Data JPA is going to automatically figure that out. We don't need to mention, use this JPQL. Just this is fine. It is going to work. But let's say you want to change something, find user products, something like that. Then it makes sense to use JPQL. Okay. Cool. That's it about repositories. Let me close all this, and next let us take a look at the service layer. Here I see one product service interface, and then there are implementation. But here we have product service implementation, which implements the product service interface. Fine. and we have user detail service which implements Spring Security user detail service. This is also fine. And we have file upload service IMPL, which doesn't implement any interface. So this is one thing I would like to bring up. Personally, I don't like to create just interfaces where there is only one implementation and there is no need for it actually. So, but if you prefer to do that, probably you can create interface for all of them just to be consistent. Whether that is what you prefer, be consistent. Otherwise, don't bother to create the interface. But here for one service, we have interface, for others we don't. So I would recommend to be consistent. So let's take a look at this user detail service implementation. Again, for Spring Security, we need to provide a implementation of this interface, which has this one interface where you get a username, in this case email, and in whatever means you find a user and for the given email and return a user detail object. So here we are calling this which is going to load a user instance from the database. In our case, user implements user details also, so we should simply return that. Otherwise, throw this username not found exception. So this is fine. And then this is something interesting, like this is not a method that we are implementing from user detail service. So from anywhere, if you want to use this method, you need to directly inject this user detail service implementation. You cannot simply inject this and then try to use this. That doesn't work. So in such case, I would prefer to leave this user detail service implementation with only implementing this load user by username method and probably create a user service and create this save user method in that one rather than clubbing these two things here. Okay, that is one solution. And then here we are doing some database operation. In this case, there is only one operation, so it is going to either success or failure, but still I would recommend to use transactions. So use transactional annotation so that whatever logic you are executing in this method is going to run in a transaction. And then here we got a user request and then we are using the builder pattern and using some random UUID for user ID and then populate the other fields. Take the plain text password, setting the encoded one and also setting the mobile number and then calling save. And if everything is success, return true, otherwise return false and then simply log it. So here is one thing. While using these Spring's transactional methods, you should not catch if there are any errors and you want to roll back the transaction. If there is any failure, instead you should let the logic throw some exception so that Spring will undo, roll back the whatever the database changes it has done. For example, just imagine you have multiple records inserted here, okay, and one of the thing got failed. For example, you insert user details and also let's say there is some user preferences table and you want to insert some default values into that table. And in the second table insertion, something got failed and you catch that exception. You simply logged it and then return the false, trying to indicate that the operation is not successful. But from the Spring perspective, this is a successful database operation because you are not throwing any exception. So Spring is going to assume everything is successful and the one operation that is succeeded is going to commit. So basically when you are doing database operations, if there is any failure, let it fail and throw the exception. Do not catch it here and return true or false to indicate success or failure. Let the database operation throw if there is any failure so that the Spring will roll back if there is any runtime exception. So I would say don't catch it. Okay. And what about this? How to indicate this? So one issue with returning a boolean, there can be multiple reasons of failures. For example, here in this case, there is a given user email is already exist in our database, so it might throw an exception for that. Or you might try to insert some invalid value into some other, let's say email accepts only till 100 characters, but you gave 150 characters, and you don't know exactly which for what reason it failed. If you simply throw true or false kind of thing, so instead I would recommend either create a specific exception indicating what exactly it got failed and then throw it, okay, instead of returning boolean. Okay, that's about user detail service, and let's go to product service implementation. Okay, here we are injecting this, and there is product request to product mappings, and you are simply extracting the details from this and then constructing a product entity. Cool. And the opposite also, we are taking a product entity and then trying to create a product response. This is also fine. Maybe you can keep it here or move it to a product mapper class, but that is not a big deal. And then we have this save product method. Again, we do not have a transactional annotation added. As I mentioned, I would strongly recommend, even if you are doing only one operation, I would say use the transactions. I mean, one database operation. And here is one thing, like if you are using an IDE like IntelliJ, you can already see this is kind of a grayed out, indicating there is something wrong. You don't need to do this. So here variable new product initializer new is redundant. So why? Because we are not using that, and a few lines later we are initializing with something else. So the object creation is completely waste. Like you are simply creating an object which you are not using anyway and throwing out by initializing it to something else. So I mean, I would recommend look at the IDE sessions. It already says you some things. So I would say take this and we are not using anywhere else. So I would remove that. Okay. And what else? Here we have, we need to create a product, and we got the request. First, we try to find whose user this product belongs to. Finding a user, if not found, we should throw exception. Instead of throwing the runtime exception, I would recommend to create a resource not found or user not found kind of exception and then throw it. And then what we are trying to do, we are trying to upload the invoice image and calling this file upload service and calling this. And the return thing is a map. If you take a look at these other methods, right? When I say find by user ID and I see this type user, I know what kind of information I'm going to get from this method. I mean, if I don't know exact properties, but at the high level, I know it is kind of some user details. But if you are returning simple map, it doesn't reveal anything. Okay, when I upload this file, what kind of information this may contain? It may contain maybe status success, or it may contain some ID of the uploaded file. I have no idea. So if you go to this file upload, again, this is a service, and here we are passing this multi-part file, and then we are getting the bytes from that. And also we are using Cloudinary to upload this file, and it is going to return some map. Fine. Maybe you know, based on the API exposed by Cloudinary, you know that, okay, if it is successful, you know this return map will contain secure URL, and then you derive the name based on the URL, and also there is a public ID. So once you extract all these details, then you can create a class called Cloudinary file or some simple record and populate these fields and then return that instead of returning a map. Okay, so that is I would recommend. Again, here imagine You call this method, you try to do uploading the file, and if everything is success, you are returning a map with secure URL and public ID, all these fields. But if there is any error, you are logging it and then again returning a map with the same keys but using these null strings. It's not even actual null, it is a string. So if somebody is calling this, no matter what, it is going to always return this map. How do you know it failed to upload? You will never know. The only way is to check whether this is equals null. So I would say, okay, if you want to catch this IO exception, catch it. And if there is any failure, throw a custom exception, file upload exception or whatnot. So let people know this operation got failed. But with the current implementation, unless they introspect the returned map and then check whether secure URL value is null or this, they don't know whether operation is successful or not. So either throw the exception here, worst case, return a null indicating that the operation got failed. But right now, the current implementation doesn't reveal whether this operation is actually successful or not. Same case here as well. Okay, let's go back to product service IMPL. Okay, we got the file response, and again we are extracting this, again knowing these fields. But if you returned an object, it is kind of a more type safe. And then you set this new product entity and set all these properties and then saving it. And then return. Again, what I mentioned about returning true or booleans, I would say don't put this in try catch. If there is any failure, let it fail so that Spring will know when to roll back this. Okay, cool. And we have this get product by ID. You take the, so it's a minor thing. In your product, you have ID and product ID. So I would say use the same name so that it is clear. It is not the primary key ID, but it's a separate product ID that we are using. So again, instead of throwing the runtime exception, I would recommend to throw a dedicated exception like product not found or resource not found, something like that. Again, you can use the add transactional with read-only true for read-only operations. Behind the scenes, JPA and Hibernate is going to perform some optimizations for that. Again, use the transactional for. Okay. So here we are finding an existing product, and based on the details provided in the request, we are overriding those details, and finally we are saving that. Again, IntelliJIDEA already showing this, indicating that you are not doing anything with the return value, so you don't need to store it also. So I would recommend IDE tells you few things, especially when it is showing errors or with a gray color. That means there is something that can be cleaned up. So again, don't catch and swallow things. If there is a failure, let it fail so that it will roll back the changes. Okay, we are fetching all the products for a given user ID and then converting into response and returning. This is fine. Again, I would say use transactional read only true. And here, delete product. We are finding a public ID and deleting the files for that public ID and also deleting the product. Okay. Okay, so here within this service, we sneak up this scheduled job. And what we are doing, we are fetching all the products irrespective of the users for products of all the users. And then we are checking, okay, warranty expiry compared to now, and then if it is expired, okay, basically just trying to update the warranty details. If it is already expired, we are doing this okay, for every 1 day or something like that, and then we are doing this. I would recommend moving this to a separate class, let's say for product warranty check job or something, instead of putting this here, just to keep things separate. Okay, I think that's it for service layer. There are a bunch of things that can be improved using the transactional annotation and not trying to catch the exception and then returning booleans, as I already mentioned. Okay, that's it about the service layer. Let's move on to other things. Okay, next let us take a look at the controllers. So here we have authentication controller, and we have this path authentication, and we are injecting here, and there is one endpoint for authentication, and then there is another endpoint for registration. So here we are going to call this save user. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about. Here you ended up injecting the implementation instead of interface, because you implemented a class specific to this implementation class, not with the user detail service. So if you split that, you would have injected this user service, where this is a dedicated method on the user service. Okay, so we have two API endpoints here. One is for login, and there is authentication request. Again, as I mentioned, this request payloads, we can use records for this, so that we don't need to have all these setters, getters, and all those things. Jackson supports binding the request payload to records, so you can make this as a request. And another thing, we do not have any validation on this, so I would say use at not empty or things like that. And also this can be a email, and also password cannot be empty. So like this you can add these annotations, and then you can use at valid, so to trigger the validation, so that you don't need to proceed if this basic validations itself is not succeeded. So once you get the data, you are calling this authentication manager, and then constructing this username password authentication token. This is fine. And then basically if there is any failure, it will throw exception, I think authentication failure exception. Otherwise, you can take it is going to return authentication, and then you can extract the details. But fine, once it is successfully authenticated, we are calling this a load username, and then get the user information, and we are constructing response entity, and we are returning a bunch of fields in a map. Again, this is technically this works, because when you return a map, it's going to respond with a JSON with this key value pairs. But I would prefer to create a record saying authentication response, and then populate all these fields and then return it. Okay, so here we are returning this user ID, full name, email, and finally we are constructing, taking the username. In this case, this could be email, and we are constructing a JWT token. We'll get into this token creation a little late, but let's move on to this API endpoint. Again, you can create this, use these annotations to validate, and then use the at valid annotation to trigger the validation when you make a request. And okay, we are calling this save user, and okay, if it is successful, we are returning created, and the body returns a string. So usually we are using this JSON as a format to pass the request and then get the response and all that. In that case, I would say let's return the map of string. Again, I would suggest to return some object, but if you want to return simply the status, this could be something like map of, let's say, status, like this. So now when somebody make a request, it is going to return the response something like this. So okay, you get this status and user registered successfully, so something like this, instead of getting it as a plain string response. I think this is a better representation of response when you are using JSON as the exchange format. Okay, so again, you can do the same here. Okay. Okay, this is about the authentication controller, and let us talk about product controller. Okay, here we are using API-v1 products. But if you take a look at the domain we have users and we have the products they uploaded, all the details. So I would say user is a primary resource and the products is a sub resource of that users. There is no use case where you need to access all the products. Instead, you always access a particular user's products. So in that case, I would use the URL pattern something like this. It would be API v1 users / there is this user ID placeholder and products, so that you are talking about the products of a particular user. Okay, so I would recommend using this URL pattern because I don't see products as the top level resource in this particular domain. Okay, so let's move on, and here we have a request to add product. And okay, in the request we are getting multiple things. One is there can be an invoice image. We are using multi-part files submission, and also it can have JSON payload as well in the request body. So we are using this request part for capturing those two parts of the request. Fine. And then we are creating an instance of object mapper and then calling this find and register modules, which is going to check all the Jackson modules and register them automatically. And then we are setting a property, serialization property, and then using to take this string request and converting back into product request. Okay, first things first, we don't need to create this, and especially every time we call this API endpoint, this is going to create a new object mapper and configure all these things, which is completely unnecessary. So you can inject this object mapper because Spring Boot automatically does that for you. And also, what about this configuration? We can customize that in our application properties, something like spring.jackson .serialization .write dates as timestamp is false. So you can customize the properties using these properties in application properties file. So here you don't need to write this, especially this is going to execute for every request, which is completely not required. So you can comment this out and then inject the object mapper and use that. And this customization, you can do that by specifying this serialization or deserialization properties. Okay, now, okay, we are converting this and then setting this multi-part file into the. I think you don't need to take this as a string and then manually convert this. Instead, you could do this. I haven't tried this myself, but I kind of feel you can directly take the part of that request and then directly map it to a DTO where you don't need to do this manually. I think you can do this. Okay, once we have the request and we set the invoice image and then call save product. If it is saved successfully, again, same session, instead of returning a response as a string, I would say return that as a map, even better to create a record as a response and then return it. If there is any failure, we are returning server response, internal server error. Okay, here users. So this is what I'm talking about here. imagine the current URL pattern, does it reflects what we are trying to do? Here we are trying to get all the products of a particular given user ID. And with the current URL pattern, the URL is like this: /API/v1/products/users. So this is the URL you need to make, but this is not revealing that I am trying to get products for a particular user. So here we are using this user ID for this particular user ID. So essentially this is something like this. But as I mentioned, I don't see products as the top level resource. Instead, users is the top level resource, and we want to get products of a particular user. So this is something that more proper representation of the RESTful URL. So here we are looking up a particular user and we are trying to get all the products of that particular user. I would recommend to use this URL pattern. Okay, and here we are getting user ID from this is some serious security issue, because even though this endpoint is secured, I can log in with my username, but I can provide any other user's UUID and get their details, whatever the product details they have. I can see anybody users. I just need to authenticate with my credentials, but I can pass the user ID of any other user and still I can get the response. Instead, I would say if there is a restriction of only a user can see their own product details, don't even take the user ID from the URL or query parameters. Instead, you should get the current logged in user information from security context and pass that as the user ID. Don't take it from the request. Look up based on the current logged in user information from the Spring security context and get product ID details. Again, while implementing this, you need to check whether this product ID belongs to the current user, logged in user, because there is an association between this product and the user. You need to verify. Otherwise, anybody can log in and then ask for any product ID. So there is no checking here whether this particular product belongs to the current user or not. That's a security issue. Okay, let me close all of this. Next, let us take a look at the configuration. We are taking the configuration properties and then we are registering a bean of type Cloudinary. This is fine, not a big deal, but another option would be to create a properties record and then using at configuration properties, specifying the prefix of Cloudinary and then automatically binding these properties. That is another approach. I would prefer that approach over using at value. So I would, okay, let me show some example from one of my repository so that you can understand what I'm suggesting. So there is a repository in my GitHub, Springboot URL shortener API. This is again using similar tech stack. It's a Springboot REST API using JWT security. So there are many things from the text standpoint of view you can look up. So in this repository, I have some similar configuration. Okay, so this is the same application, and what I was talking about is, let's say I have this application properties where I use this configuration properties annotation and specify the prefix. So I have a few properties here: base URL, default expiration, and all that. One approach is using at value annotation and specifying app.base URL to bind the properties. Or if you take a look at this, so here I have this app.base URL, app.default expiration in days, so things like that. And instead of using at value, I am using this configuration properties annotation and then specifying this app. So Spring is going to take care of taking this app.base URL property and then assigning it to this one. You can also mention the validation here. When you start the application, if you haven't provided any value to this, it will take default value, or in this case if you provide some invalid values, it will throw exception on the application startup time itself. So I would say this is much more feature rich if you follow this approach, because you can fail fast. You don't need to start the application only to fail later when some operation is involved. Okay, so I would recommend this approach over using at value. Okay, we register this Cloudinary bean and then JWT decoder config. So this is what I was talking about when I mentioned when you have OAuth 2 resource server and also JJWT libraries. So here what we are doing, we create a configuration class. We took some secret key from the properties, and then we are registering a JWT decoder, okay, with whatever the configuration we have, and we are using that somewhere. So internally, when you are making a request, because you configured OAuth 2 resource server, it is going to automatically use Spring Security is going to use this JWT decoder to extract the authentication header and bearer token and then trying to decode that. It will automatically do that. But the other scenario where we are trying to authenticate and you need to create a JWT token, where we are doing that. So here in the authentication controller, we are using this login and then we are calling this JWT util.generate token. So if you take a look at this utility, this is there in this JWT package. Again, we are taking the same secret key and then using this JWT builder and blah 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 and creating a token using a different library. Maybe we are using the same secret, that probably works, but we are using two different things. Instead, there is a JWT encoder also provided by the same Spring Security JWT library resource server, so that you don't need to use for decoding this using OAuth 2 resource server components, for encoding this using JJWT thing. So instead, I am going to show you in a configuration from my application. Here I am using the same Spring Security OAuth 2 resource server, and this is how I configure the application. So here I have this JWT security config and I configure a JWT decoder. So here there are we can generate the keys, public private keys. Let me take a look at so here using OpenSSL you can generate a key pair and then you can extract the public and private keys and you can copy them into your search folder. Here I have all these things, public and private keys, and in application properties I configure where is my private key and where is my public key. From the class path I am representing these two files here, and in the auto configuration I am using this public key while configuring this JWT decoder, and also I am registering this JWT encoder, which is again coming from the same Spring Security resource server dependency. I am not using JJWT, a separate library. So here again I configure this as a JWT encoder, and also we can configure is there any common prefix for roles, something like that, and we don't have, so we can configure this bean. With this configuration, now when we want to authenticate, I'm going to use a repository JWT token helper. So here I inject that JWT encoder, which I auto configured this bean here. I'm going to inject this and I'm using this JWT encoder and creating the token finally. So you don't need to use different things for encoding and decoding. You can configure this JWT encoder bean and use the same for generating a token as well, so that you don't need to use different libraries. Okay, so that's about the JWT configuration. Next, what do we have here? Security configuration. Okay, we are disabling this. Again, IntelliJ is showing some, okay, replace this. I think you can even use CSRF configurer to disable, and cars defaults, and then you specified all this which you want to enable for public access, and everything else should be authenticated. Fine. And again you have some warning here. It seems JWT, this is deprecated. Probably you can use whatever is recommended now. So what could be the recommended approach is, let me comment this out, and you can use this, where you can use the lambda to simply specify use the defaults. So this is how you can fix that. And here is one thing, you can register the cars filter by specifying all these. But if you are building a Spring MVC based application with Spring Security, you don't need to register the cars configuration, something like that. Instead, you can use this web MVC config. Let me create a configuration class here. So here we can create a configuration class implementing web MVC configurer, and then you can configure what are the paths you want to configure for, and what are the allowed origins, allowed methods, and all that by simply like this. You don't need to configure something like this very verbose. So, but again, both approaches works. But if you are building a Spring MVC based application, I would prefer to keep it simple, something like this. Okay, we have, we don't need to expose this as a bcrypt password encoder. Usually you use interface and provide what is the implementation you want to register. And also registering this authentication manager bin, I see this is how many applications try to register earlier. But if you take a look at the official documentation from Spring Security, let me bring it here. So here, if you go to Spring Security documentation, there is a section called Publish Authentication Manager bin. Exactly that is the case we have. If you want to register this as a bin, if you want to authenticate users via REST API instead of form login, you can do this. And the way they recommend is using taking this user detail service and password encoder and create this DAO authentication provider, and set both user detail service and password encoder, and return this provider manager. So from the application, from the official documentation, that is what something they are recommending. So I would prefer to follow that. But either approach works, but I would prefer to go with this official recommendation. So that's it about the configuration as well. Okay, let me close this, and I think that's all at the overall. But again, I don't see any tests, which is sad. I would highly recommend writing tests so that you can easily verify. See, I'm suggesting all these changes. Okay, so if we have a test suite, we can make those changes, immediately run those tests and see if anything is broken or not. Otherwise, now there is no automated way to verify that. So you need to make the session, either go manually verify by invoking the API endpoints and all that. So that is why I strongly recommend writing tests. And also along the whole review process, I recommend some things like using Flyway or writing tests, or using Docker Compose for setting up the infrastructure and all that, right? I would like to share some resources that you can take a look at. As I already mentioned, there is one application in my GitHub repository, Springboot URL Shortener API. I would add the links in the video description, but also there are a few more resources. If you don't know, I am a Java developer advocate working at JetBrains, and I wrote a bunch of articles specifically for Spring Boot application developers. So I recommended to use Flyway. If you are not familiar with Flyway and how to use this, there is an article called How to Use Flyway for Database Migrations in Spring Boot application. I would recommend to check this out, where you understand why should I use Flyway in the first place, and once you convinced this is a good way, you can take a look at how to use this in your Spring Boot application. Similarly, I am recommending to use test containers for spinning up a MySQL instance and then write your test. So if you want to learn, you can check out this article. And also you can use this mock MVC tester, which is a new API. Earlier we were using mock MVC for making a API request and then verifying the responses, but this provides much better API with a fluent API methods and all that. So you can take a look at this article as well. So I would recommend to take a look at this, and if you are using IntelliJDea Ultimate, there are many cool features with Spring Debugger plugin. I would recommend to take a look at them. So as I mentioned, I'm going to add the links to all these resources that I'm referring to, all this in the video description, so that you can take a look at them, and probably you can apply those recommendations. So what I'm going to do is, all the points that I mentioned, I'm going to add as a review comments here. And also I'm going to add all the links to the resources that I am referring, so that you can take a look at them and then maybe apply into your repository. So again, I hope this review process is helpful, and let me know what you feel about the review. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.